Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel. Thank you for joining me for another true crime deep dive, and I promise I'm going to take these Halloween decorations down soon. It's just not at the top of my priority list, and it kind of is comforting for me. Today we are diving into part 4 of the Anne Marie Fahey case. If you have not seen parts 1 through 3 yet, they will be linked in the description box, and you should probably watch those first, or none of this will make any sense. And in today's video, things are going to get spicy, okay? There isn't anything more drama-fueled than family turning on family. I've been gone for a week. I'm back. I was happy to dive into work. It was an interesting trip to Disney World. If you are a Patreon, you're going to hear about it soon. I'm going to go over the whole story in a Patreon live, but it was interesting, to say the least. Lots of great memories made, lots of lessons learned. I am very happy to be back with you today. However, I just want to really make sure you understand that, because I would rather be here sitting in front of a camera talking to you guys than in the happiest place in the world. And today is not the last part of this case. There's one more video after this, but you will obviously not have to wait a week. In fact, it will be out very shortly after this part, because I already had to make you wait long enough for this, and I would never dream of doing that to you again. But before we dive into the video, let's have a word from the sponsor of today's video, Casetify. Casetify is protection with personality, and those are two things that I want for my phone. I mean, if you think about it, right, the main job of a phone case is to protect your phone from breaking, because that's obviously the worst. But you also don't want it to look boring or bulky or plain. We look at our phones every day. We carry them around. Everyone sees them in our hands. We want them to show off our personality or our passions. And because everyone is different, Casetify cases are not one size fits all. They do have some lovely ready-to-go designs. They have collabs with different companies. You know, there's Disney collabs and things like that. But you can also personalize everything about your case from start to finish. You can choose your favorite colors from the Casetify colorways. You can choose between matte cases, sheer cases, clear cases, and you can add unique touches like your initials, your name, or really like anything else that you want to put on there. I personalized this buttery soft vegan leather case. I had Harlowe written on there, and I really love this because the colors look so good together, like the light brown leather with the gold script and the little gold heart. Really cute. Like, you probably can't see it here, but this is gold and it like shimmers. And of course, you guys already know I love my Yoga Skeletons case. I love this case so much that I got it in like a sheer blue color so I could still see the blue color of my phone, because I love this case so much. My Yoga Skeletons, they're always with me. They don't turn their back on me. But enough about how cute they are, right? Do they protect your phone? That's the million-dollar question, and the answer is, of course, yes. Casetify's impact cases and their ultra impact cases are the world's slimmest, most protective phone cases out there. The impact cases are made with a 2-layer construction of Chi-Tech material, and they're drop test approved for up to 6.6 feet and 9.8 feet for the ultra impact cases. I've dropped my phone roughly 300 times just this month while I was in a Casetify case, and it's still going strong. If you don't believe me, check out this drop test. I'm not even scared. I'm gonna throw my phone all over the place. Casetify's cases also have an antimicrobial coating on them, which kills 99% of bacteria. And I think we're all a little more germ conscious these days than we have been in the past. This is a really great feature. The cases are made with 65% recycled material, and they're compatible with 5G and wireless charging. So now the question is, what are you waiting for? Go to casetify.com/stephanieharlowe today to get 15% off your new favorite phone case. Once again, that's casetify.com/stephanieharlowe to get 15% off. And don't forget, there's an E on the end of Stephanie and Harlowe. Now let's dive deep into this video. It is my opinion, my humble opinion, that Thomas Capano truly felt if he avoided the police long enough and he acted self-righteous enough, the disappearance of Anne Marie Fahey would slowly leave the headlines and the minds of the people of Delaware. People like Thomas Capano, they see themselves as incredibly important. Not just important to themselves, not just important to their family or their circle of friends, but important to everybody. But people like Thomas Capano see people like Anne Marie Fahey as expendable. He saw her as a woman who had not yet made her impact on the world. and probably never would. So he thought, who's going to go after me, right? This very prominent and respected figure, when the person missing is really only important to her immediate family. Like this town, the city, they're not going to turn everything upside down to go after me. And no one's going to actually believe that I orchestrated the disappearance of a young woman, right? But many people did believe it. And for law enforcement, both local and federal, it was really the only explanation. At the time, the Delaware state prosecutor was a man named Ferris Wharton. And in an interview with Delaware Online, Wharton explained how the investigation into Tom Capano was truly kicked off. He said, quote, Colm Connolly, a federal prosecutor, started investigating when he saw there were reports of Anne Marie Fahey and Tom Capano at dinner in Philadelphia. He thought there might be a kidnapping involved in some way, shape, or form, and he began to investigate. About a month into it, I got a call from him. He asked me to come over to the U.S. Attorney's office. He said, look, we've been doing this thing. We've gotten to the point where we're about ready to execute a search warrant on Capano's house on Grant Avenue, end quote. Now, the question is, what had gotten them to the point where they were ready to start putting some pressure on Tom Capano? Well, first and foremost, Anne Marie's boss, Thomas Carper, the governor, he'd received a call from the then president, Bill Clinton. And Bill Clinton said that he'd heard Anne Marie was missing. And although he didn't know her personally, several members of his staff had dealt with her on a regular basis, and they all thought she was great, and they were worried about her. Clinton said that he wanted Carper to pass a message along to the Fahey family. If they needed anything at all, they should let him know. Carper asked Clinton if maybe the FBI could get involved, and Clinton responded, quote, federal assistance can probably be made available if it's necessary and appropriate. I can't give you any assurances, but I'll look into it, end quote. So this was printed in the papers that Bill Clinton had, offered to send federal assistance, even though he really didn't offer that. He said he would look into it. But they started printing in the papers that Clinton was involved, the president was involved, the federal government was involved. And this obviously made waves. Secondly, Colm Connolly, the federal prosecutor in charge of Anne Marie's case, who, by the way, is like such an interesting figure. I really respect him. If you read about his past, his history, his education, the things he's done, he's got it going on. Like, he's a get this shit done kind of guy. But anyway, Connolly had been going through Tom Capano's credit card statements, looking for anything that stood out, and something did. A $308 purchase made at a business called Wallpaper Warehouse on June 29th. 2 days after Anne Marie had vanished. Now, initially, Connolly thought that Tom had purchased actual wallpaper, which confused him because he knew that Tom lived in a rented house. So you can't just be painting and doing all this stuff and putting wallpaper up when you don't own the house. So this caused him to dig a little bit deeper. He called the wallpaper store only to find out that Tom had not been shopping for wallpaper at all. He'd paid for a new Oriental rug, which then led Connolly to theorize that Tom had killed Anne Marie in his house on Grant Avenue, and then he had used a rug that was in his home to roll her up in. Additionally, authorities had previously spoken to Tom Capano's cleaning lady, Ruth Boylan, who had told them that she hadn't really noticed anything different in the house of the man that she worked for, but that had been before they discovered the rug purchase. Now they needed to talk to Ruth again to see if she could confirm that the new rug had replaced an already existing rug. So Ruth Boylan told detectives that she had not only noticed a new rug in Capano's Grant Avenue home, but some new furniture as well. Ruth said that in the den, there'd been a cream-colored carpet and a rose-colored sofa with a pineapple pattern on it. But now the carpet was an Oriental carpet, blue and green, and the sofa had been replaced by 2 chairs. Now, Ruth, I would say that's something different. That's something different that you probably noticed in the house. But I guess it took the rug purchase to jog her memory. Additionally, from Tom's credit card statements, it was discovered that on Sunday, June 30th, he'd made some purchases at Happy Harry's drugstore. When the clerk was asked if she'd seen Tom Capano that day, she said that yes, he had come in asking for something that would remove blood stains. So she suggested a Carbona cleaner, and he bought it. On July 29th, detectives met with Anne Marie's therapist, Michelle Sullivan. The therapist was insistent when she said she did not believe that Anne Marie would have gone to dinner with Capano on the night of June 27th unless it was to end things between them for good. Sullivan also said she did not think that Anne-Marie would have willingly gone to Tom's house that evening because Anne-Marie was concerned about him doing something drastic to her, and she would never have put herself in a position of being alone with him outside of a public area. A search of phone records showed that Tom Capano was a frequent user of the telephone feature star 69. So star 69 is a call return, which means that if you dial it on your phone, it's going to call the last number who called you. On the evening that Anne-Marie had dinner with Tom Capano, someone had dialed star 69 from her apartment at 11:52 p.m. And at 12:05 a.m., someone dialed star 69 from Tom Capano's Grant Avenue home. On July 30th, Colm Connolly and his team got the go-ahead to search Tom's house and vehicle. Meanwhile, Tom Capano was having to answer some tough questions. Now, he wasn't answering these questions from the police or the public, of course. Instead, he was giving explanations to members of his family who were wondering why his name and face were being splashed all over every newspaper, tabloid, and news network. The Sunday after Anne-Marie went missing, Tom called his brother Louis and told him to come right over. He had something important to discuss with him. When Louis arrived to the Grant Avenue house, Tom told him that he had been having a relationship with the missing woman, but he'd ended things with her several months prior because Anne-Marie was anorexic and bulimic, and she struggled with several other mental health issues. Instead of being her boyfriend, he had become her caregiver, and he was paying for her to see a therapist, hoping that this would help her get better. Now, of course, Tom may have been contributing some money to Anne-Marie's therapy, but her brother, her older brother Robert, was actually the one paying for it. Tom told his brother Louis that he felt Anne-Marie still really needed a friend after they broke up, so they continued to see each other casually, and on the evening of June 27th, he had taken her to dinner in Philadelphia before returning to his house later that evening. So far, this is the same story that Tom had told the police, but at this point in the timeline, he pivoted when telling it to Louis. Tom claimed that when they got back to the house, his house, he had gone to use the bathroom, and when he returned to the living room, he was shocked and horrified to find that Anne-Marie had slit her own wrists, and she had gotten some blood on the furniture. Tom claimed that luckily, Anne-Marie's wounds were just superficial, so he bandaged them up and drove her home, and that was the last time he had seen her, because it seems perfectly reasonable to leave someone alone less than 30 minutes after they've attempted to take their own life. Some caregiver you are, Tom. Like, really top-notch, A+. Mother Teresa, get out of the way, Tom Capano's here. So while Louis was processing all of this, Tom slipped in a very strange request. He wanted to know if Louis could have the dumpsters at the Capano construction sites emptied out, because he said that he and his other brother Jerry had disposed of some material in those dumpsters. Louis said that he would give the order to have them emptied, but before driving back home, he stopped at the construction site closest to Tom's house at Concord Pike. Louis looked into the large dumpster there, and he saw that there was a sofa inside, a sofa turned upside down with its legs pointing upwards. This same day, Tom stormed into his longtime secret lover's home, and he handed Debbie McIntyre a bag containing 3 adult-themed videos. He asked her to hold on to the videos for him because if the police searched his house, he'd be embarrassed if they found them. Not long after this, Mike Castle and his wife were walking down Grant Avenue. Mike Castle was a career politician, and he'd served as the Deputy Attorney General for Delaware in the 60s before being elected to the Delaware House of Representatives. In the 80s, he was elected by the people of Delaware to serve as their governor for 2 terms, but when he strolled by Tom Capano's house in the summer of 1996, he was a congressman attending the party of some friends. Both Castle and his wife Jane saw Tom Capano, who they both knew well, in his driveway, vacuuming the carpets of a large SUV. This SUV was not Tom's Jeep, but his wife Kay's Chevy Suburban. Mike and Jane said hello to Tom, and Castle remembered that Tom was unusually chatty and friendly that day. He typically was not so friendly. He typically was not so willing to pull himself away from his busy and important life to make small talk with political acquaintances. We know that after seeing the castles on the road and after finishing his cleanup of Kay's vehicle, Tom drove his daughters back to the home he had previously shared with them, and that was when he was approached by detectives, and they asked to look through his home for the first time. Now remember, they'd walked through his home before, but Tom said don't look in any drawers, don't look in any closets, and it was a very cursory sort of search. After they left, Tom drove back to Debbie McIntyre's house and asked to use her phone. Apparently, the Capanos' holdings stretched far and wide, and they included a Holiday Inn located in Penn Station, New Jersey. That evening, Tom made 3 calls from Debbie's house. One was to this Holiday Inn, and the others were to the home number of the manager of that Holiday Inn. Now, in my opinion, it was no accident that Tom decided to make these calls from Debbie's place instead of his own, and you'll see why later. Tom told the Holiday Inn manager that he wanted to make sure the hotel's dumpsters were emptied out as soon as possible. The following Monday, Louis Capano got a call from his brother, Tom. Tom said that Anne-Marie had not shown up for work, and he asked again if the dumpsters had been emptied. Louis said no, he'd forgotten all about it, to which Tom responded, quote, "Could you have them dumped right away? I'm afraid the police might start looking around and check them," end quote. And, does Louis say, why would you be afraid that the police are going to check the dumpsters? Do you have something to hide? What's going to be in the dumpsters? Why are you using our dumpsters to hide your criminal activity? Does Louis ask any of those questions? Allegedly, no. So Louis gave the order to empty the dumpsters to the man who was overseeing the construction projects. His name was Shaw Taylor. But Shaw Taylor was very familiar with the inner workings of the company. I mean, Louis Capano, who owned the company, he's out and about, going on jet skis, traveling all over the place, hanging out with his wife, who was like an LPGA golfer. And so obviously he pays other people, underlings, to handle the day-to-day. So Shaw was very familiar with the day-to-day, whereas Louis Capano really wasn't. And Shaw knew that it was not time for the dumpsters to be emptied, so he went over to check them himself. He then told Louis Capano's son, Louis Capano III, to call his daddy and tell him the dumpsters were only half full, which little Louis did, only to be shouted at by his father to just get it done. Now, little Louis, he was learning the ropes of the family business, and so he knew that when you got a direct order from the boss or from your daddy, it was best to not ask questions, and the dumpsters were emptied. And I haven't mentioned much in this video about Jerry Capano yet because there were many conversations happening with him at this time, but we'll get to that later because it's a whole different level and layer. On the morning of July 31st, several agents camped outside of Tom Capano's home, waiting for his mistress Debbie to leave for work. When she was spotted leaving the house, they moved in. FBI agent Tim Munson recalled the look on Tom's face when he informed him that they were there to execute a federal search warrant. Munson said, quote, "His face turned ashen. You could actually see the blood drain from his face. He never, ever expected the FBI to come knocking," end quote. The agents were there to do a thorough search, not simply a polite once-over, and they were looking for everything. They were looking for hairs, fibers, bodily fluids, weapons, or objects that could be used to inflict blunt force injury or strangulation. They were also on the lookout for cleaning supplies like vacuums, mops, cloths, tools that could be used to clean up a crime scene, but tools that also might still have remnants of that crime scene microscopically embedded in them. I mean, these guys were serious, and Tom knew it, which threw him into a tailspin of anxiety and fear, which personally makes me really happy because he was now going to get a taste of what Anne-Marie had lived with every day, what he often imposed on her himself: stress, anxiety, the fear of the unknown, a loss of control. So an FBI agent named Eric Alpert, he followed Tom into the bedroom so that Tom could get dressed for the day, and Tom was so twisted and stressed out that Alpert had to help Tom pick out a suit to wear because Tom just couldn't even. He couldn't focus. And Alpert remembered having to remove a heavy wool suit from Tom's hand and suggest a lighter fabric suit instead because it was hot out that day. For a moment, Tom stepped into the bathroom that was connected to his bedroom, but when Alpert heard the toilet flush, he rushed in, thinking that Tom was trying to flush evidence. And he was like, "What the hell are you doing?" And Tom was surprised by this quick response. And he was like, "Listen, I didn't do anything. I just flushed a cigarette." But Alpert had the entire toilet taken apart so the drain pipes could be checked. The FBI and the forensics team did find several spots of blood in Tom Capano's house. In the den, the room where the carpet and the furniture had been replaced, they found a small spot of blood on the bottom of one of the radiators. They also found blood on a baseboard in the den and on the laundry room door, as well as a small spot on the backseat of Tom's Jeep. Agents also intercepted Tom's wife, Kay, on her way to work, and they informed her that they needed to take her vehicle into custody. FBI agent Tim Munson pulled himself away from the search for a moment to make a statement to the waiting media and public outside, saying that the FBI, the Wilmington Police Department, and the Delaware State Police had joined forces to take on a kidnapping investigation. Tom Capano's attorney, Charles Oberle, also stood outside the house, telling the media that his client would have been fine with the police searching his house again if only they'd asked. It was unclear how the police were supposed to ask when Tom Capano had refused to speak to them, but that's how the game is played, I guess, right? The best defense attorneys know how to take the attention away from their clients and play the blame game. Oberle said that the police were using Gestapo tactics and his client was being turned into a scapegoat. A scapegoat for what exactly, though? We don't know. They never provide any evidence. They're never like, oh, this person did it, and they're trying to cover it up and pin it on someone else. They never give, evidence. They just make these wild claims and accusations and hope that that's enough to convince the general public. While Charles Oberle was trying to gain public sympathy for Tom, the federal agents inside the house discovered that a portion of the stairwell wall had recently been replaced. So the existing wall had been cut out and then new drywall was put in, it was sanded, painted, etc. Shortly after the search at Tom's house, many people came forward to speak in support of him. In-demand Delaware criminal defense attorney Joe Hurley said, quote, "It's unimaginable. I sent Tom a note myself in sympathy more than anything else. This will haunt him to his grave and hurt his career, which has been exemplary," end quote. But Anne Marie's sister, Kathleen, told the Philadelphia Inquirer, quote, "I've known Thomas Capano for probably 15 years. Up until 6 weeks ago, I thought he was a nice man. Now, I probably know more about Thomas Capano than his wife even does. And what I know of him now, he's not a nice man. Now, looking around the apartment, I realize there are a lot of things he gave her, things that Annie didn't have the money for. Expensive cappuccino makers. There's this big TV in her living room. I asked her where she got it. She said she won it. I was like, oh, that's good luck. Now things make sense," end quote. Now remember Shaw Taylor, the man who was overseeing construction projects for Louis Capano. He'd already been feeling very uneasy about the whole situation, the order to clear out the dumpster ahead of schedule, and he'd sort of been mentioning to other employees that it all just seemed too convenient. Anne Marie Fahey going missing after having dinner with Thomas Capano, and then the Capanos suddenly being gung-ho to take out the trash. Louis got word of Taylor's suspicions, and he confronted Shaw Taylor, telling him to just go with the flow, stop asking questions, because Louis couldn't tell Taylor anything. But the whole situation, it could end up being very bad for their company if they didn't close ranks and stay together. I'm not sure if this was supposed to comfort Shaw Taylor, but it didn't. At this point, Shaw Taylor strongly felt that he'd been roped into covering up a murder, so he set a meeting with the federal agents on Anne Marie's case. Taylor's information led Colm Connolly to Harvey & Harvey, the hauling company that was responsible for emptying the dumpsters at the construction sites. Harvey & Harvey told Connolly where they'd taken the trash, and between August 12th and August 16th, a team of detectives, FBI agents, and crime scene technicians picked through the Cherry Island landfill and also a nearby recycling plant. They were able to find 3 tan carpets, some carpet padding, and a stained brown carpet, and all of the evidence from the searches at the landfill and the search from Capano's home were sent in for testing. But the FBI was having a hard time finding anything that had Anne Marie's DNA on it, because she was such a neat freak. She had not even left one strand of hair in her hairbrush. There was no strands of hair in her hat or on her clothes. And Tom Capano, who had moved in with his brother Louis, he was refusing to give authorities a sample of his DNA. This time, though, the police didn't resign themselves to the fact that he wasn't going to cooperate. They just went and got another warrant, ordering Capano to produce 2 vials of blood, 25 samples of hair from his head, and 25 samples of pubic hair. I am sure that Tom, with all of his allegations about the police being obsessed with his sex life, he was probably thrilled to have them pluck out 25 pubic hairs. Because listen, for DNA testing, the root has to be present. They couldn't cut or shave the hairs. They had to be pulled out, and I imagine it was very uncomfortable. Now, the way they ended up getting Anne-Marie's DNA was much more complicated. They found out from her family that she often donated blood, and it was discovered through her email correspondence that she had done so the previous April. So the police called the Blood Bank of Delaware, but they were disappointed to find out that her blood donation had been sold to a distributor who had shipped it to Europe. Now, does it make anyone else uncomfortable to know that we're donating blood to hopefully save lives, and these people are profiting off of our blood donations? They're like, we don't need it here. Let's just sell it to a different country. Like, is this standard practice? You know, it's fine with me if they want to give it to the other country, but I don't know how I feel about, like, taking time away from my day to go and get a needle put in my arm, because I hate needles, and to have you take my blood and then profit off of it. If someone knows more about this than I do, please tell me in the comments. Anyways, they eventually located her blood in Switzerland, and they paid to have a sample sent back to the States. And surprise, surprise, the sample matched the blood that was found in Tom Capano's house. It was actually very lucky that Anne-Marie's case had garnered so much media attention due to, obviously, the scandalous tinge to her disappearance. Anne-Marie may not have been known far and wide, but the Capano family was, and as soon as their name was printed next to hers in the papers, anyone who'd had interactions with them in the prior months began calling in to tell their stories. One of these tipsters was an employee of the General Motors plant, which was about 6 miles away from Wilmington. He told the authorities that a coworker of his had recently purchased a boat from Tom's brother, Jerry Capano, but the boat had not come with an anchor, and the tipster speculated that maybe the anchor was with Anne-Marie at the bottom of the ocean. This led the FBI to Jerry Capano, someone they were obviously already familiar with due to his checkered past. Agents met with Mike Caputo, the man who had purchased the fishing boat named the Summer Wind. Caputo said that Jerry had told him the boat was in excellent condition, but it would not come with life jackets, flares, or anchors because he needed those things for his new boat. As soon as Jerry found out that the feds had found the boat and they were sniffing around, he did the only thing he knew how to do. He went right to his golden boy brother and he asked Tom what they should do, and he asked Tom to fix it. Tom called an old friend of his, Dan Lyons, a lawyer, and he asked him to represent his brother Jerry, and then he and Jerry worked out an alibi, which Jerry intelligently wrote down on a yellow Post-it note, which he put in his pocket. And the Post-it note read, quote, "You were at my house at 5:45. Wanted to talk about Capano investments. I went to work, then met you at your house about 7:38. We talked. I left for the beach, did my thing, saw you around 1-ish. We talked again because you saw Louie. Then I left. You stayed. I met at your house around 5 to help you move a love seat. It looked old, that's all. Helped you throw it in a dumpster, and then I left. That's what I'm telling Dan Lyons on Friday." End quote. Poor Jerry, man, poor Jerry. Not the sharpest crayon in the box. On August 5th, Thomas Capano and his attorneys were presented with a target letter. A target letter is just a document that informs the recipient that they need to perform a certain action. And this letter was written to inform Tom that he was to be the subject of a grand jury investigation into the suspected kidnapping of Anne-Marie Fahey. Tom immediately went into panic mode, knowing that many people would be subpoenaed to testify in front of the grand jury, including probably his lover, Debbie, and his brothers, Louis and Jerry. On August 29th, the day of the first grand jury session, Tom told Louis that he was going to need an alibi, and he asked if Louis would tell the authorities that Tom had been at his house early on the morning of Friday, June 28th, discussing Capano Investments business. I mean, it didn't really matter so much when Louis agreed to lie for his brother because Com Connolly had already talked to several of Louis's employees. Like I said, Connolly did his job. Connolly had talked to Shaw Taylor and other people, and he knew that he couldn't believe a word that came out of Louis's mouth. The Capanos had already shown that they stuck together, no matter what. Well, maybe not no matter what. Maybe there was an exception. And Tom Capano truly and vehemently hated Colm Connolly. He had called him a heartless, gutless, soulless disgrace of a human being. It's like one of those things where it's like, I know you are, but what am I? Ferris Wharton believes that this hatred stemmed, for the most part, from Capano's loss of control. He had really believed that he could control the Wilmington police, but when the federal government, in the shape of Colm Connolly, became involved, Tom lost that control. And if it was one thing Tom hated more than anything in the world, it was a loss of control. Tom Capano also didn't like that Connolly didn't feel that anything was off limits in his search for the truth, including Tom's daughters. During one session of the grand jury, Connolly had subpoenaed Tom's 16-year-old daughter, Christine, for a grand jury session in September. Tom had been telling people that the blood found in his home, it probably belonged to his daughter, Christy. But when Connolly tried to get a sample of Christy's blood, Capano had refused to allow her to supply it. So Connolly brought her to the grand jury to ask her about the blood under oath. And poor Christy, wrapped up in all of this mess, she's just 16 years old, I can't even imagine, she wouldn't speak, and she was held in contempt of court. It was the first time that Tom Capano and Colm Connolly would meet face to face. And as Tom passed Colm in the hallway outside the courtroom, he said to the prosecutor, or growled at the prosecutor, quote, "I hope you can sleep at night," end quote. Later, when Tom Capano was cuffed and sitting in an interrogation room, and Colm Connolly looked into his eyes, Connolly was happy to tell Tom that he did in fact sleep very well at night. This would be Connolly's first and only murder case. He was a young prosecutor, just 33 years old, but he was sharp and determined to get his man. This case had no body, no murder weapon, no witnesses to the crime, and the legal experts were already predicting that Connolly would not be able to get a conviction, and he could not wait to prove them wrong. In November, while the grand jury was still secretly meeting, there was a break in the investigation. Eric Alpert got a warrant for the office of a partner who worked in the law firm that Tom Capano worked in. This man had no idea what was going on when federal agents busted into his office, went directly to his bookshelf, and removed 10 sheets of paper that were hidden amongst the books. Clearly, the FBI knew exactly where these papers were, and it's likely that they got a tip of some sort, but they never revealed where the information had come from. But on these pages, they found, among other things, a timeline of sorts, penned in Tom Capano's own handwriting. The timeline consisted of times and names, but no dates. It said 6:30, Jerry, 7 o'clock, K, 7:15, track, 7:45, DM, 8 o'clock, Lewis, with a question mark, 8:30, calls, 8:45, Lewis, with a question mark, 9:15 to 10:30, drive to SH, which I assume means Stone Harbor and not Stephanie Harlowe, because I wouldn't let that man even pull into my driveway. Okay, he's not visiting me. Anyways, 10:30 to 11, wait for Jerry. 11 to 12, Marion's. Marion is Tom Capano's sister. 12 to 12:30, Mom's. 12:30 plus, Jerry. 12:30 to 1:30, lunch with Jerry. 1:30 to 3, view property, discuss price and CI sale. 3, Jerry leaves. 3:30, Tom leaves. 5 o'clock, dump love seat. 5:30, 17th Street dinner. 11, leave kids. Now, some might look at this and say, it doesn't seem to be suspicious. You know, at a quick glance, it seems like a to-do list. I have tons of these in every notebook littering my desk. But the timeline, it happened to match the timeline that Tom was giving for June 28th, the day after Anne-Marie had vanished. And if it was a simple to-do list, why was it hidden in a bookshelf in someone else's office? Clearly because Tom knew that his home was going to be searched, and his office would probably be searched as well. Now, the other sheets of paper were basically just laundry lists of everything that was wrong with Anne-Marie Fahey. Tom had also written a few paragraphs that he no doubt would try to use to explain to law enforcement why Anne-Marie's blood would be found in his home. He said that on Tuesday, June 18th, Anne-Marie had needed to leave work early because of her heavy menstrual flow, which apparently had stained her clothes and she needed to change. That night, conveniently enough, Anne-Marie was at his house on Grant Avenue for dinner. So that blood that they would soon find in his house, it was just heavy menstrual blood. You know, because when they get their periods, women do all sorts of crazy things, like rub themselves on baseboards and radiators. You know, we become like cats in heat when Aunt Flo is in town. Just gotta mark our territory with our blood. What a damn fool. Anyways, the timeline did lead the federal agents to Stone Harbor, where they had conducted a secret land and sea search, and they canvassed the neighborhood around Jerry Capano's home, asking those in the area if they'd seen anything large enough to hold a body being carried onto or off of a boat. No one had seen anything like that, but Jeffrey Strape, who lived next door to Jerry, he told the authorities that he'd seen Tom Capano parked in Jerry's driveway on the morning of June 28th, very early at about 5:45 in the morning. Stape said that when Tom saw him looking, Tom sort of turned away and tried to hide himself, but Stape knew Tom's black Jeep and he knew Tom. So he was like, "What are you hiding for, dude? You're here all the time. I know who you are." Now, Debbie McIntyre. She seemed to believe him when Tom told her he had nothing to do with Anne Marie's disappearance. She had talked to the police back in July, and I guess she was as honest as she could be, except she failed to mention that Tom had asked her to purchase a gun for him. Later, she would claim she'd forgotten all about it, but I don't believe her. I mean, she had been waiting so long for Tom Capano to become available, right? He was married to Kay. He's having affairs with this woman and that woman. She had been waiting for over a decade to have him to herself, and now she felt that she did for the first time, and she didn't really want anything to get in the way of that. Besides, Tom had been spending a lot of time with her and her children, and Tom and Debbie were talking about getting married and spending their lives together. But every once in a while, Tom's true nature would emerge. You can't hide who you really are forever. For instance, Tom had told Debbie's high school-aged daughter, Victoria, that she looked like a slut in the dress she had chosen for the winter dance. When Victoria began to cry, Tom seemed surprised and taken aback, and he said, quote, "What? I didn't mean that as an insult. I say that to my girls all the time. They think it's funny," end quote. We're supposed to believe that a well-educated, socially adept attorney would lack that much common sense that he would believe calling a teenage girl a slut would come off as anything besides an insult? Gaslighting at its finest, ladies and gents. I don't know why you're so upset. I was just kidding. God, you're so sensitive. I'm just joking. What's wrong with you? It's you. It's not me. Tom, Debbie, and her children spent Christmas together that year. He gave Debbie a KitchenAid mixer for her present, which is totally something he would do. I'm sure for their anniversary, he would give her a vacuum cleaner. But this brief moment of normalcy would be short-lived for Debbie. At the beginning of January 1997, the affidavit of probable cause that had been filed in order to get the search warrant for Tom's house, it was released to the press and the public, and so was Debbie McIntyre's name. The column said, quote, "On June 28, 1996, at 12:30 a.m., star 69 was also dialed from Capano's phone. This retrieved a call from 47-year-old Debbie McIntyre, a Tatnall school director and Capano friend who lives on Delaware Avenue," end quote. Yo, they just be giving out everything back then, right? What? This is where she works. This is her full name. This is where she lives. My God. It seems irresponsible, right? I mean, it's the media, so I think irresponsible is part of their job description. So Tom had told Debbie to not inform the police that they'd been seeing each other for over a decade. He said that the optics would be better for her if she made it seem as if they'd gotten together after he separated from his wife. Obviously, the optics would be better for him, not necessarily her. But I'm sure that Debbie was still not comfortable with Kay Capano knowing that she and Tom were in contact and talking to each other after midnight. I'm sure that would raise some red flags since Debbie and Kay were still good friends, which that's messed up, Debbie. That's messed up. Okay, you wanted to sleep with her husband. I'm not going to tell you what to do, but you got to cut the friendship off. That's just devious, man. And when that affidavit was released to the press, the Fahey family, they were devastated. Before then, they could still have hope that Anne Marie might be alive out there somewhere. But now, with the presence of blood in Tom Capano's home, that hope was burning far less brightly. Then, Tom's legal team felt it would be a good idea to combat the affidavit information with their own information. Letters sent from Anne Marie to Tom. These letters were then printed in the paper for everybody to read. One of the letters said, quote, "Tommy, hola amigo. I wanted to drop you a wee note to let you know how much I appreciate all you have done and continue to do for me. You're a very genuine person. We've been through a lot the past couple of years and have managed through hard work and determination and perhaps a bit of stubborn Irishness and Italian tempers to prevail. You'll always own a special place in my heart. Love you." End quote. So this is what Tom's doing, right? He's releasing these letters where, Anne-Marie is just heaping praise on him because that's what she did, right? That's what she always did. Even when she was fed up with him, she never really had the guts to tell him how she was feeling, to tell him that she thought he was a stalker, to tell him that she thought he was a narcissistic psychopath. She never had the heart to do that because there was the guilt that he had done so much for her already. So she was able to vent her frustrations to others, but she felt too bad to say it to him because there's always a chance that he just really cared about her and really loved her. And how could she be mad at that? So yes, obviously many of her letters were, her tiptoeing around the issue and her saying nice things to him and trying to make him feel good. And I really get that too, because men like this, if you're straight up with them, if they get a bruised ego, they'll just get mad, they'll freeze you out. And not only that, they'll try to mess with your life. They'll try to take things away from you, like a job. They'll spread rumors about you to make you look bad. Like, that's what people like that do. So yes, she was always being careful when she spoke to him. Tom had also brought on another well-known defense attorney, Joseph Hurley, who was infamous for his dramatic antics, but was a very good attorney. Tom was going to need as many good lawyers as he could find because the carefully curated pieces of his life and lies were slowly falling apart, revealing a good deal of damage and darkness underneath, not only in Tom's life, but the lives of many of the Capanos. His brother Louis was married to a woman named Lori Merton, who's actually a notable figure all on her own. She's a professional golfer who won the U.S. Women's Open in 1993. However, Lori traveled a lot for her career. She got to go to different places and play golf, and she was so sure that her husband Louis was messing around on her while she was gone that she allegedly put recording devices in their home, the same home that Thomas Capano had been living in since his home had been searched the previous summer. The FBI received a tip about this from an anonymous source, and they asked Lori for the tapes of the recordings, but she refused, citing marital privilege. She was held in contempt, and on April 24th, the Court of Appeals ruled that she did not have to turn those tapes over, but she would remain in contempt until she testified. By the way, Louis was cheating on her. So honestly, if it was me, because I can be a little vindictive and petty, I would have been like, yo, here's the tapes, guys. Take them. To hell with my husband and his entire family. They're crazy. In September of 1997, the name Linda Marandola was included in an affidavit filed by the FBI. Once again, if you don't remember, Linda was the woman that Tom Capano had become obsessed with in the 80s, and when she rejected him, he harassed her and tried to have her taken out. Now, this was an important bit of information because it illustrated a pattern of behavior. Anne-Marie was not the first woman whose life Tom Capano had infiltrated, and when he didn't get what he wanted, he could become quite vindictive and violent. See, I'm vindictive, but never violent. Jerry Capano, the youngest and most wild of all the Capano brothers, was also now on the Fed's radar. It was clear that Jerry had none of the wit and intelligence of his other brothers, and he would be easy to lean on. He had a long history of drug abuse and criminal activity, and many in his close circle of friends had lengthy prison records. So, Colm Connolly got in touch with the ATF, letting them know about Jerry Capano's extensive collection of firearms, which, when placed next to his extensive use of drugs and alcohol, was terrifying and illegal. So, on the evening of October 8th, 1997, the ATF showed up at Jerry's mansion to serve him with a search warrant. They were looking for any evidence that would point to illegal activities, especially cocaine possession or possession of a firearm by a drug user, which, like I said, is illegal. The agents found an unlocked gun safe in one of the kids' bedrooms, which is disturbing, right? And altogether, they removed from that house 10 shotguns, 4 rifles, 6 revolvers, and 8 illegal explosive devices. There was also cocaine found in Jerry's truck, as well as a bag of cocaine hidden in a laundry room cupboard next to a rolled-up dollar bill and a credit card with powder residue on it. It was a lot of bad stuff, admittedly, but it wasn't enough. And they wanted to make sure that when they approached Jerry with a deal, he was going to be in a position where he would have to take it because he'd have everything to lose if he didn't cooperate. So the following week, the ATF served a search warrant at the home of Jerry's best friend, Ed Del Colo, who was a convicted felon. In his possession, they found a gun whose serial number led back to Jerry Capano, meaning that Jerry had broken another law by purchasing a gun for a convicted felon, which carried a sentence of up to 3 years in a federal prison. The following month, on November 8th, 1997, Jerry Capano and his lawyer, Dan Lyons, met with the team investigating Anne Marie Fahey's disappearance. It did not take much for Jerry to agree to work with the feds in order to save his own skin. And the story Jerry told was shocking, to say the least. He admitted that his brother Tom had asked to borrow $8,000 from him in February of 1996, money that he had needed to pay off a pair of extortionists who were trying to ruin his career and threaten his family. Jerry also admitted to letting Tom borrow a 10mm gun from him. Jerry claimed that when Tom had told him he needed the gun and that he might have to kill the people who were extorting him, Jerry thought he was just being dramatic and blowing off some steam, which is why he didn't report this to the authorities. But then, on June 28th at 6 a.m., Jerry had walked out of his house to find Tom's black Jeep parked in his driveway and his brother sitting in the driver's seat, casually reading the morning paper. Jerry claimed that when he approached the car, Tom asked him to use his boat, the Summer Wind. And Jerry understood in that moment that his brother had killed someone. And he asked him, did you do it? And Tom was like, yeah. Tom asked for Jerry's help to dispose of the body. And Jerry claimed that he told him no, because he had a wife and children and a great life that he didn't want to destroy. So if Tom really wanted to use the boat, he could take it, but Jerry was not going to be going with him. Tom begged Jerry, and he asked him not to leave him hanging like this. Tom said, I don't know anything about boats, not even how to drive one, so it's going to be a mess. If I'm out there and I'm running into stuff or I hit another boat, they're going to find out. It's not good. I can't be driving a boat. So Jerry gave in and agreed to meet his brother at his Grant Avenue home and help him get rid of the body of the extortionist that Tom had needed to kill to protect himself and the family he loved so much, of course. When Jerry arrived at Tom's house, I think it was around 8 a.m., he saw a large cooler with a chain wrapped around it and a lock on the chain, as well as a rolled-up rug in the garage. Together, they loaded the cooler into the back of Kay Capano's Chevy Suburban, and they drove to Jerry's place in Stone Harbor, New Jersey, where his boat, the Summer Wind, was docked. Jerry said he remembered that the cooler was very heavy, and he could hear ice moving around inside of it. Jerry then drove the boat with Tom and the cooler on board about 70 miles out into the Atlantic Ocean, where the water was about 198 feet deep. Very specific. Together, Jerry and Tom tipped the cooler off the side of the boat into the choppy waves, but it didn't sink because it's a cooler and it's sealed and it's not going to sink. So Jerry grabbed a gun that he had used for shark hunting, a big 12-gauge Mossberg shotgun, and he aimed and he fired at the cooler. He did end up hitting the cooler, but the cooler still didn't sink. However, Jerry queasily recalled that he could see blood dribbling out from the hole that the bullet had made in the cooler. The cooler was floating further away from their boat at that point, and they couldn't leave it floating because it might be discovered. So Jerry pulled the boat up next to the drifting cooler. Tom grabbed the cooler, and Jerry handed him 2 anchors from the boat to affix to the cooler before telling his brother that he was done, right? This was as far as he went. Tom would be on his own for the rest of whatever he had planned, and Jerry said he turned his back at that point. Now, allegedly, Tom Capano opened the cooler, planning to place the anchors inside with Anne Marie's body, but he actually wrapped the anchors around her body. Faced with the gruesomeness of what he had done, Tom began throwing up over the side of the boat. He was finally able to get the chains of the anchors around Anne Marie's body, and he turned the open cooler over, effectively tipping her now anchored body out of it. At that moment, Jerry turned around and saw what he described as a human foot and part of a calf disappearing beneath the water. All in all, the brothers Grimm were out on the high seas for about 5 hours, and when they arrived back in Stone Harbor, it was past 3 in the afternoon. On the drive back to Wilmington, Tom instructed his brother on what to say, should anyone ask. Jerry told the FBI, quote, "He told me to say that he and I drove to the beach and we were with each other in the morning, that he was talking. I think he was talking to my brother Louis about some properties that we owned, and that we went down and I went to the beach with him to show him my beach property, and we just turned around and we had lunch down there and we turned around and went home," end quote. They were back in Wilmington by 5 p.m., but Tom's work was not done for the day, and neither was Jerry's for that matter. Now, Tom wanted his brother's help getting rid of a rose-colored sofa with pineapples on it that was stained with a copious amount of blood on the right back cushion. Tom told Jerry that he'd tried to clean the blood off using Clorox, but the stain was too deep, so they needed to dispose of it. But of course, at this time of the day, it was still light outside, and they couldn't very well parade out in front of the good citizens of Wilmington carrying a pink sofa with blood all over it. So Jerry cut the blood stain out of the couch's fabric with his pocket knife, and he tried to make the piece of furniture look old and broken so no one would see it in the dumpster and think that it might be worth salvaging. Jerry then tasked his brother Tom with taking the foam that formed the inside of the sofa, which was also stained with blood, and put those pieces into a garbage bag. Strips of the large cream blood-stained rug were thrown in on top of the foam pieces. The Capano brothers then drove the mangled sofa to the construction site, where they dumped the sofa in upside down. Jerry got into the dumpster and moved some garbage around, trying to conceal the sofa. After this portion of the task was completed, an exhausted and stressed out Jerry went home, probably to seek refuge with his rolled-up dollar bill in the laundry room. Tom also went back to his house and grabbed the garbage bag containing the foam from the sofa and the sliced-up area rug. He disposed of these things in the dumpster of the Penns Grove Holiday Inn that his family owned, and then he went to visit with his daughters, as if nothing had happened. They ordered pizza, they watched a movie, and he fell asleep during the movie, very dad thing to do, and when he woke up at 11 p.m., he drove to Debbie's house, climbed into bed with her, and promptly fell asleep because being an evil villain is exhausting work, after all. According to Colm Connolly, during their interview with Jerry, the man was an absolute mess. Connolly said, quote, "Jerry was distraught. He cried at times. He felt sick. He was very upset. He felt horrible about what he had done and what was going to happen to his brother as a result of coming in." End quote. After Jerry had told them everything he knew, including his brother Lewis's involvement, the FBI called Lewis's lawyer and arranged to make a deal with him as well. And on November 12th, both Jerry and Lewis appeared before the grand jury to testify. Now, the two men had to be snuck into the building through the basement because law enforcement didn't want Tom Capano to know that his brothers had turned on him and that his arrest was imminent, and there was media and cameras all around that place. They didn't want Tom to know that his brothers were turning on him because they didn't want him to run. But while they were sitting in court, waiting for the grand jury to convene, Eric Alpert got some news that suggested Tom might be running already. Colm Connolly had ordered 24-hour surveillance of their main suspect, and early that morning, the surveillance team followed Tom Capano to the home of his brother, Joe. The agents saw Joe and his wife, Joanne, leave the house with suitcases and climb into Tom's vehicle before they drove away, getting on the highway. It was a pickle for Colm Connolly to be in, because he had not wanted to arrest Tom until Tom's brothers had testified. But if Tom crossed state lines, Connolly knew he was going to have to cut through a lot of red tape to get him back to Delaware, so he instructed the agents following Tom to arrest him immediately for obstruction of justice. It turned out that Tom Capano was not actually fleeing. He was just dropping his brother and his brother's wife off to the airport for a trip they were taking to Florida, but he was in custody now, and that meant the clock was ticking. They brought him to the Chase Manhattan building in Wilmington, where the U.S. Attorney's Office was housed, and Colm Connolly ran 5 blocks from the grand jury to the room where Tom Capano sat, cuffed, looking miserable, and Connolly told Tom, "Listen, don't say anything until your lawyers arrive. We don't want to talk to you until you have an attorney present." But before leaving the room, he turned back, and like I said, he let Tom Capano know that he slept very well at night, especially after this arrest. There was a problem, though. Connolly wanted to charge Tom Capano with first-degree murder, but he knew that he would be taking a chance with a jury trial. Their 2 star witnesses were not exactly choir boys, and they were giving their testimony because they were getting deals. And Tom had the means to hire all the most expensive and productive attorneys in the world. It would only take one member of the jury to hold out and prevent Tom from ever facing any consequences. So Colm Connolly decided to show Tom the case that they had built against him and then offer him a deal. If Tom pleaded guilty to kidnapping resulting in murder, he would get life in prison, but they would not pursue the death penalty. The authorities had not actually located the cooler that they believed had been used to dispose of Anne-Marie's body, but they purchased the same exact one, and they put it on a table in a conference room along with a lock and a chain like the one Jerry had seen around Tom's cooler. I don't know if this was for effect or if they honestly expected Tom to think that this was the cooler, because they do this trick a lot. I mean, I don't know if law enforcement does it in general, but this team of law enforcement individuals, they do this a lot. They do it with Debbie later with a gun. So I think that they thought he would think it was the real cooler, but Tom knew that his cooler had a bullet hole in it and this one did not. So I don't know if they expected Tom to believe that this cooler was the actual cooler or if it was just for like effect, like, we know about the cooler. When they brought Tom and his lawyers in, they told him that both Jerry and Lewis had testified against him at the grand jury. And Tom was not shaken by this. He scoffed, like, you would even believe them? Like, do you know their backgrounds? Like, do you know who these people are? Who would believe these two clowns? Not a jury. And then they played the taped interviews for him, the interviews that they had had with Lewis and Jerry, which were taped, and this put him in a very, very foul mood. Connolly offered Tom the deal, but it didn't seem that there was much hope in him taking it. His attorney, Joseph Hurley, marched right out to the press and began to malign his client's brothers. He said that Jerry was a drug dealer who had been pushed out of the Capano family because he was an embarrassment. He could not be trusted. And Hurley said, quote, "You can bet every dollar in your pocket and every hair on your head that Tom Capano is going to plead not guilty," end quote. But at that moment, Tom Capano was being charged with murder, he was being held without bail, and he was being introduced to his new home, a tiny little prison cell where he would have to just pee in front of all the other prisoners. Although Anne Marie's family were given all the details that Jerry Capano had revealed, Colm Connolly asked them to be very discreet about the fact that the cooler with Anne Marie's body in it had been shot with a gun. However, a good deal of the rest of the story was shared with the media, and it caught the attention of Dave Shepard, an electrical engineer with Onboard Chemical Corporation in Newark. Shepard remembered that one of his coworkers had pulled a big cooler out of the water on July 4th, 1996, off the Indian River outlet, about 100 miles away from where Jerry and Tom had allegedly thrown Anne Marie into the ocean. Dave Shepard remembered that there had been bullet holes in that cooler, and although the news had not reported anything about bullet holes, he thought it was still worth a shot, so he called the police. As soon as Eric Alpert heard Shepard describe the cooler and the bullet holes, he knew that they were onto something because they had not released that to the media. Alpert brought along a detective from the Wilmington Police Department, and they paid a visit that same night to the home of Ken Chubb in Bay City. Ken was the man who had initially found the cooler, and luckily he still had it stored in his shed. He told the police that he and his son had been fishing off a Rehoboth Bay when they'd spotted something white bobbing in the water, a cooler missing a handle and its lid, and featuring 2 prominent bullet holes. Ken Chubbs said, quote, "It had 2 bullet holes in it, and it sort of amazed us. We were questioning, wondering why anybody would shoot it. Looked like a brand new cooler," end quote. Ken also said that when the cooler had first come into his possession, there was a pinkish-looking stain on the inside bottom of it, but he didn't really think anything of it at the time because that was typical for the cooler of a fisherman because fish can bleed. When the police got the cooler in their hands, they were like, holy shit, this is amazing. The bullet holes were still there, but they'd been filled with fiberglass epoxy, and Ken Chubbs had used a lid from a different cooler and patched the holes in order to use it. The barcode was also still on the cooler, and when it was checked against the cooler that Tom Capano had purchased from Sports Authority, they had a match. This was the cooler that Tom Capano had bought. This was the cooler that Jerry Capano had described dumping into the Atlantic. This was the cooler that had been shot with a shark hunting gun so that it and its contents, aka Anne Marie, would sink into the watery depths and never be seen again. Now, the police may not have had a body, but this was the next best thing. Matthew Pleasant was a criminal investigator for the U.S. Coast Guard who had spent over a decade learning about and operating underwater sonar equipment. He was stationed in Cape May, New Jersey, and after hearing about Jerry Capano's statement on the news, he called the Delaware State Police and offered his help and his services in the search with Anne Marie, with the hopes that her family might at least be able to retrieve her body for burial. The authorities allowed him to talk to Jerry so that he could take notes of what Jerry remembered from the morning of June 28th. How far out had they gone? What landmarks had they seen? Which direction did they go in when they pulled away from his dock? Jerry told Matthew Pleasant that he had headed for Hereford's Inlet with the sun over the bow of his boat, and it had taken roughly 2.5 hours to reach the spot where he eventually would stop. The FBI was able to get the summer wind back from the man Jerry had sold it to, and Pleasant took another officer out in this boat trying to retrace the footsteps, or, I guess it wouldn't be footsteps because it's the ocean, but the footsteps of Jerry and Tom Capano. They knew that it would be very difficult to spot a human body, especially with such a large depth, but they were hoping to spot the anchors that Jerry had given Tom to place around Anne-Marie's body. It was hopeless, though. So much time had passed, and the ocean is just always in motion, not just in the form of waves and tides, but also in the form of currents, either at the surface or deep within the water. It's always moving. One more attempt to locate her body would be made in June of 1998, but when that search came up empty as well, Anne-Marie Fahey was declared legally dead.
The real tragedy here is that the world lost a very beautiful, loving person and who had a very close family and who never got to bury her and never had the full closure that comes with a burial, and obviously lost somebody they loved too soon, and because somebody was a very evil individual.
On November 14th, Tom Capano, while in prison, met with neuropsychiatrist Dr. Carol Tavani, who'd been tasked with evaluating him. Dr. Tavani thought that Tom was just a pleasure to be around. She said that he was, quote, most pleasant. He was cooperative with me, cognitively, intellectually intact, very upset that his brother or brothers would have turned on him, end quote. Yes, you did nothing to deserve that. You're just an innocent victim. Poor Tom. Dr. Tavani thought that Tom did seem very depressed and anxious, which I feel is pretty obvious, considering Tom was sitting in prison with a murder charge and a possible death sentence hanging over him. I mean, that's understandable. I would be surprised if he wasn't. This guy, just 6 months before, he had everything. A great job, more money than he knew what to do with, 4 beautiful daughters who loved him, a wife who supported him, a mistress who stayed silently by his side for over a decade and never asked him for more than he could give. He was going out to dinner several nights a week, rubbing elbows with the who's who of Delaware and Washington. He was known, respected, people looked at him as an important figure, and now he was sitting in a prison cell telling Dr. Carol Tavani that although he was not suicidal, he wished that he would just have a massive heart attack so that he would die. Tom Capano was placed in solitary confinement for his own protection, considering how infamous he had become and also the fact that he had once been a driving force behind the Wilmington Police Department, and many of the people that he had prosecuted were sitting in that prison. He was only allowed out for 1 hour a day, during which he was also alone, and he was only allowed to have 6 books a month, which he probably hated because there's no television in his cell. He had nothing to do, and he loved reading. So when you have so many hours in the day to fill and nothing to fill it with besides reading, and you're a voracious reader like Tom Capano, 6 books isn't going to last very long. So Tom filled some of these empty hours with writing letters to his longtime secret lover, Debbie McIntyre, as well as the newest addition to his self-imagined harem, Susan Louth. Now, even with Tom behind bars for murdering one of his lovers, allegedly, Debbie wrote to him and spoke to him on the phone every single day. There was no doubt in her mind that he was innocent. He was going to beat the charge, and then they would get married and ride off into the sunset together, happily ever after, all that jazz. Debbie said, quote, "We really talked mostly about emotions, how he was feeling, how he was faring, what I was doing. We rarely talked about the case. He said a couple of times that he didn't want to talk about the case because he didn't know how safe the phones were." End quote. If you're in prison, the phones aren't safe at all. Everything's being recorded. So there's your answer, Tom. Debbie did have one question, though, that she wanted to get off her chest. During one of their phone calls, she asked Tom what he had done with the gun that he had her buy for him, and he immediately got upset and short with her. And he said, "Don't talk about this stuff over the phone." It was also confusing to Debbie that while she was standing by her man and praying for his quick release, Tom was actively asking her to sleep with other men and then tell him about it. For instance, in one of his letters to Debbie, Tom wrote, quote, "Dear Deb, it's 11:57 p.m., and with any luck, you're naked right now and on all fours with your dinner date making you blank, like crazy, doggy style. Actually, you say something in your Monday night letter, which arrived tonight, about having your period. Okay, so maybe you're naked anyway, so he can admire your magnificent body on your knees and his okay. I'm not going to go on, but you get the idea, right? You get the idea. And also, what's going on here? Tom Capano was a lawyer, right? He knew that everything he sent from prison would be opened and read before leaving those four walls, especially in his position. On one hand, he's complaining about the police being too interested in the sordid details of his sex life, but here he is, on the other hand, writing them an entire, Harlequin novel with more details than anyone would ever ask for. On November 22nd, the grand jury had finally made their decision. They felt that there was enough to indict Tom Capano with first-degree murder of Anne Marie Fahey. His trial would start early the following year, and Judge William Swain Lee was appointed to hear the case. While the lawyers prepared their case, the investigators continued gathering evidence, and what they really wanted was the murder weapon. Jerry Capano had told them that the gun he'd let his brother borrow had been returned to him without one bullet being shot, so they tried to find out if Tom himself had purchased a gun in the months leading up to Anne Marie's disappearance. He had not, but Debbie McIntyre had, just 45 days before Anne Marie dropped off the face of the earth. This, in combination with the extortionist story that Tom had been telling both Debbie and Jerry, the police strongly felt that this had been a premeditated act. This had not been some argument gone wrong, an act of violence in the heat of the moment. Tom had carefully planned Anne Marie's demise months before she even vanished. The police did not believe that Debbie herself had anything to do with the crime, but they were sure that she'd been convinced by Tom to make the gun purchase, most likely not knowing what it was intended for. But while all of this was happening, Tom Capano was pleading not guilty, and his trial was scheduled to begin in February of 1998. Tom and his legal team had talked it over, and they felt that the testimony of Debbie McIntyre was sure to get him off the hook. She was head over heels for him. She would do anything for him, even lie under oath. In a letter to Debbie, Tom told her that his lawyers had said, quote, "Debbie McIntyre is an important witness for us, but maybe more importantly, she's an impressive witness. We want Judge Lee to see and hear this very credible and honest woman because she will make a very positive impression. She comes across not just as honest, but also as level-headed and mature," end quote. Okay, Tom, I see you. Any other time, she's an idiot and a doormat, but when you need something from her, she's credible, honest, mature, impressive even. As Tom was writing this letter, on January 28th, Debbie was meeting with Colm Connolly, the lead prosecutor on the case, and she was armed with the fabricated story that Tom had supplied her with. She told Connolly that the recent crime wave in Wilmington had scared her, and even though the man in her life, aka Tom, was not happy about her having a gun in her house, she felt she needed it for the protection of herself and her children. Debbie also said that she'd gotten rid of the gun after she was afraid her children would find it, so she just ended up deciding to update her alarm system. This is how Debbie says she got rid of the gun, right? So she took the gun apart, and then she put the two pieces into separate garbage bags, and then she threw the garbage bags into the garbage can on June 10th, over 2 weeks before Anne Marie had gone missing. I mean, I know this is what really happened, but that's not the way to get rid of a gun, not the way at all, Debbie. That is dumb. But the investigators had told her some things that made her question if Tom was giving her the whole truth. She said, quote, "The volcano erupted on January 28th. There was a flash in my head halfway through that interview. That's the only way I can describe how I felt. The Tom I knew was not this man who would kill this woman. But once I betrayed him, or rejected him, so to speak, I woke up and realized the position I was in because I loved him and believed him and trusted him. I was compromising myself, my safety, and that of my children. It was like a volcano erupting," end quote. Tom's lawyers would be disappointed that Debbie would end up not being the slam-dunk credible witness that they had banked on. Well, she would be, but not for them. But Tom would be going into trial with a legal team that looked very different from when he had first started hiring lawyers to protect him from having to answer any questions about his role in Anne Marie's disappearance. Remember, he'd brought on his old friend, Charlie Oberly, but he had also hired Joseph Hurley, the flashy criminal defense attorney who had been steadfastly announcing Tom's innocence from every rooftop in Delaware. Delaware Today called Hurley Delaware's most outrageous lawyer, wild and crazy, but one of the best. And Philadelphia Magazine wrote, quote, "If you allegedly did it, get Joe Hurley," end quote. Well, 6 months before the trial started, Hurley quit. He claims that while he was attending a funeral mass at St. Helena's Catholic Church on April 6, 1998, he had a moment of self-reflection and clarity. He had like a spiritual conversation with God. Hurley claims that he had never asked Tom if Tom had killed Anne-Marie because he didn't want to know the answer, and Tom had never supplied that information to him willingly. But of course, being a smart guy who was privy to all of the evidence, Hurley was feeling not so great about it. He said, quote, "I can only surmise that there was something making me feel like I was falling into an evil pit, and this conversation, if that's what you have with God, it went, 'Joe, you're not like this. You can't be this way.' I think I was probably facing the reality that Capano was in fact guilty of premeditated murder. Killing a human being? No, that's the end of a friendship," end quote. Because remember, Hurley, even before he was Tom's lawyer, he was the one defending Tom, telling people that he had sent him a letter of apology and this was going to ruin his exemplary career and ruin his life and things like that. A very different tune from then until now. After Hurley quit the legal team, he never saw or spoke to Tom Capano again. Now, Capano went on to hire Eugene Moorer Jr., a Wilmington attorney who was at first thrilled to be representing Tom until he realized what we already know. The man was a nightmare. Moorer said that very soon after coming onto the legal team, he wanted to quit, but he was worried about what it would look like for Tom having 2 attorneys quit on him within such a short time period. But Tom was not done stacking his deck yet. He also brought on 2 more lawyers, Joe O'Terry from Boston and Jack O'Donnell, a friend of Tom's from college who had moved to Florida to practice law, specifically death penalty cases. These 2 men joined Eugene Moorer and Charlie Oberly to create what was referred to as the Dream Team. But like I said, it was more of a nightmare. Recalling the addition of the 2 out-of-town lawyers, Eugene Moorer said, quote, "Joe O'Terry arrived on the scene with a lot of bluster to assume the role of lead counsel at Tom's urging. We were later joined by a Florida attorney who had attended school with Tom and showed up uninvited to the prison, proceeding to convince Tom that he would be an invaluable part of the defense team. Oberly and I took a back seat as lead counsel O'Terry orchestrated the weekly meetings with Tom at the prison, where the 2 of them would try to out-manipulate each other," end quote. Even the pushy and unflappable Joe O'Terry was annoyed with Tom Capano, saying, quote, "He was a very, very domineering guy. I was used to calling the shots in a case, and we agreed that I would do that in this case. He made it extremely difficult to do that because he contested everything that you wanted to do. He had his own ideas, and he was taking advice from people in the jail rather than the people he was paying for. And it was tough. There's all kinds of jailhouse lawyers. Plus, the fact that he's a lawyer and he's tried cases, that made him an instant expert. It was a problem," end quote. Oh yeah, guys, Tom Capano, even from solitary confinement, he made a lot of friends on the inside, a lot of friends who would come to do his bidding as he was making sure to keep their commissary accounts flush with cash. But we'll talk about that in the next and final part of the series, and let me tell you, it's crazy. Eugene Moorer Jr. called the representation of Tom Capano one of the most depressing and disappointing professional experiences of his life.
I think, as I mentioned in the article, there were 2 lawyers that came in from out of town that Mr. Capano had hired, one from Boston and one from Florida, and the interaction among the 3 of us, the 4 of us actually, was another Delaware lawyer, was not the greatest in the world. Furthermore, the client, as I indicated in the article, was an extremely difficult client, and in terms of not being able to, he was going to just do what he wanted to do, no matter what kind of advice you gave him. So it was frustrating, very frustrating case. There wasn't that much you could do with it. You had a client who, I'll give you an example. As far as his testifying during the course of the trial, 3 of his 4 lawyers advised him not to testify, so he of course did, okay? He had his version of what happened in terms of the trial, which was the worst defense he could have chosen in terms of what he said. He was saying that he didn't do it, and the evidence that he did was pretty overwhelming. And I think had he never really knew exactly what happened, but there was some evidence to argue that he had done it and that it might have been a heat of passion thing, or extreme emotional distress or something like that, but he just would not go down that road. So it was very, probably, as I think I mentioned, the single most frustrating case I've had in my long professional career. Most of the time we were able to reach a consensus in terms of the advice that we were giving him, but the actual way that it played out in the courtroom and the styles of the out-of-state lawyers, Delaware is a very funny place. I'm from Philadelphia originally, and you've got to be a certain way in order to be attractive to Delaware juries, and these guys were much more confrontational, and so that doesn't always play real well. And even if we reached a consensus, the main person in the consensus would have to be him, and he would always, not always, but more often than not, he would decide for himself what he was going to do. There were sort of two Tom Capanos. I think I tried to bring that out in my article too. There was the one Tom Capano who was generous and who helped St. Anthony's Church, gave them a lot of money, and at times would volunteer his time. He could be charming and affable when he wanted to be, but when Tom, as I learned, did not get what he wanted when he wanted it, his mind closed, and it was like a steel trap, and he would be ruthless in terms of getting what he wanted, and he had this sense that everyone owed him fealty or loyalty to everything because he was such a good person to them, and that's how he felt about this girl. I mean, he felt that he had rescued her and done this and done that, and how dare she go off with another guy and be happy. He couldn't handle it. So that's the sad part, is that he could have been a good person, but he ended up, the other side of him basically took over.
And that is where we're going to end today's video. There's one more part left, and if you thought you couldn't be shocked or surprised by any slimy, evil thing Tom Capano does or did, just wait. Thank you so much for being here. Don't forget to follow my podcast, Crime Weekly. I co-host Crime Weekly every week with retired police detective Derek Lavasser. We have new episodes that go out on audio platforms wherever you get your podcast, Spotify, Apple, whatever. They come out every Friday, and then our YouTube video on our YouTube channel goes up the following Wednesday. Also, don't forget to follow me on social media, Twitter, Instagram. All the handles are in the description box. Like this video if you liked it. Share it if you think it's worth sharing. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, because YouTube, they are a controlling mistress, They just don't want me to have any friends outside of them. They don't want you guys to stay and watch me, so they unsubscribe you. But we're going to show them that no one runs us. No one tells us what to do. So just don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. And if you have already, make sure you still are subscribed. Thank you so much for being here. Stay kind, stay beautiful, stay safe, and I will see you very soon. Bye.
Don't break now, and the battle's going straight down, and that river runs deep, the mountains get steep, and the voices getting too loud. All these feelings I've buried, it's looking like a cemetery. They're coming back from the grave, calling out my name, better say a Hail Mary. Well, you don't know how deep it goes until it's getting you slowly. So you got to let it go. I got blood.